The courtroom buzzed with the usual mundane energy of legal proceedings. Lawyers shuffled papers, murmuring quietly with their clients, and the faint sound of pens scratching on notepads filled the air. The case was a run-of-the-mill corporate fraud case. Nothing out of the ordinary. The kind of case where the judge expected the usual drama, the same old arguments, the same old back and forths. Judge Mitchell sat on his high perch, his robe flowing around him like a cloak of authority. He had seen thousands of cases, most of them mundane, but there was always something about each one that kept him intrigued. His gavel banged loudly against the wooden desk, calling the court to order. His voice was steady, commanding. Order in the court. The case of Miller Enterprises versus the Federal Trade Commission is now in session. Let's proceed. But just as the usual routine began to settle in, the door at the back of the courtroom creaked open. The room went silent as a figure stepped in. The faint sound of whispers rippled through the room like a wave crashing on the shore. Clint Eastwood. Yes, the Clint Eastwood, the legendary actor, director, and all-around American icon. The man who had graced the silver screen with unforgettable characters like the gritty Man with No Name and the determined Dirty Harry. But here he was, not in a movie theater, not on set, but standing in the doorway of a real courtroom. He didn't look like a man trying to make an entrance. No fanfare, no flashy gesture. Just Clint, dressed in a plain navy suit, his trademark squint giving off that air of silent confidence. His face, weathered by years of experience, both on screen and off, was a stark contrast to the younger, more polished actors the world had grown accustomed to. His posture was straight, yet there was a calmness to his demeanor, a quiet authority that commanded respect without needing to say a word. Judge Mitchell glanced up from his papers, squinting as if trying to process what was happening. For a moment, there was confusion. The judge was a man who prided himself on knowing exactly who was in his courtroom at all times, but this was unexpected. He knew the face, of course. Clint Eastwood was a household name, the embodiment of American toughness, but why was he here, in this courthouse, at this moment? For a split second, the judge's surprise morphed into a sly smile, and then, the chuckle escaped. Well. If it isn't Clint Eastwood himself. I thought you were busy making movies, not playing hero in my courtroom. The room stirred. People turned their heads to look, unsure of what to make of the situation. Some whispered in disbelief, others in awe. Was Clint Eastwood here for some sort of stunt? Or maybe he was just visiting a friend in law enforcement. Perhaps he was here to lend his celebrity weight to the proceedings. Whatever it was, people couldn't help but stare. Clint didn't flinch. His hands rested at his sides, and he walked toward the front of the room with the same deliberate calmness that had made him a Hollywood legend. His gaze never left the judge's face. There was no sense of arrogance in his movements, just the quiet assurance that had defined him both on screen and in real life. The judge, still smiling, leaned back in his chair, clearly amused. What's next, Mr. Eastwood? You gonna flash that badge of yours and make us all stand at attention? Is this some kind of stunt for your latest film? Clint's lips barely twitched, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing at the corners of his mouth. It was the same look he had given his foes in countless films, calm, collected, but always with a hint of something deeper beneath the surface. The judge's mockery continued, unaware of what was about to unfold. I guess you think you can just walk in here and get special treatment, huh? Or do you think your fame will intimidate us into giving you a free pass? But Clint didn't answer with words. He simply reached into his jacket pocket, his movements slow and deliberate. It was a gesture that went unnoticed by most in the room, but for the few who were paying close attention, there was something almost haunting in the way he moved. The room fell still as Clint slowly withdrew an object from inside his suit. Clint held it up for all to see. A badge. But not just any badge. The glimmer of gold and silver caught the light, and a collective gasp rippled through the room as the words engraved on the badge became visible, United States Secret Service. The judge's smile vanished instantly. His eyes widened in disbelief, his earlier jest quickly dissolving into an air of discomfort. The room that had once buzzed with whispers now stood utterly still. No one dared speak. No one dared move. The man standing before them wasn't just a movie star. He was an active agent of the U.S. Secret Service, a figure that commanded respect, and more importantly, one who carried the weight of national security with every step he took. For a moment, Judge Mitchell was silent. The smugness that had characterized his demeanor evaporated in an instant. He stared at Clint, unsure how to process what had just happened. The very air in the courtroom seemed to change, the atmosphere thick with tension. People exchanged confused glances, unsure of what to make of the situation. Clint spoke then, his voice steady, calm, and unwavering. "Your Honor, I'm not here for any movie role. I'm here for something far more important than a courtroom drama. I'm here on a matter of national security, and it's time we addressed that." The judge opened his mouth to respond but found no words. His pride had been deflated, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't know what to say. The courtroom remained frozen in the heavy silence that followed. All eyes were on Clint Eastwood, not as a Hollywood legend, but as a man with a purpose far beyond the scope of this court. The stakes had just changed, and everyone in the room could feel it. Clint, with his calm presence, walked to the witness stand. The gavel fell, softly at first, and Judge Mitchell struggled to regain his composure. This wasn't the day he had expected. This wasn't the kind of case he had anticipated. The moment was anything but ordinary. And in the courtroom that day, everything had shifted. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Clint Eastwood wasn't just a man who had become a household name through his work in Hollywood. He was more than the rugged anti-hero who had stared down bad guys on the silver screen. Beneath the iconic tough guy exterior lay a man with a history that few knew about, a man who had lived through much more than movie scripts ever allowed. Before the cameras, before the fame, Clint had lived a life of duty, commitment, and sacrifice. He had been drafted into the U.S. Army during the Korean War, an experience that changed the course of his life forever. It wasn't the kind of thing he talked about in interviews, but it was an integral part of who he was. The war had shaped his character, instilled in him a sense of duty to his country that would never leave him. That deep-rooted sense of honor, mixed with the wisdom gained from years in a career where the line between good and evil was often blurred, would one day lead him to become more than just an actor. Clint's time in the military was far from glamorous. He wasn't on the front lines fighting the enemy in the way one might imagine. Instead, he had served as a reconnaissance photographer, capturing images that would be used in intelligence reports. But it wasn't the job itself that left an impact. It was the people he met, the camaraderie, and the stark reality of the world he had been thrust into at such a young age. The time Clint spent in the military was formative, and it instilled in him a deep respect for the institutions that protected the country. But the true path to his secret life began after his discharge, when he was recruited into the U.S. Secret Service. While his Hollywood fame took center stage, Clint's work with the Secret Service remained a closely guarded secret, one he would protect with the same quiet determination he had carried throughout his entire life. As a member of the Secret Service, Clint had worked in numerous high-stakes environments, providing security for some of the most prominent individuals in the country. But unlike most agents, Clint wasn't just there for protection, he was trained in covert operations and intelligence gathering. Over the years, Clint had become an expert in reading people, understanding their motives, and noticing the smallest details that others might overlook. His time on set, playing characters who lived in morally gray areas, gave him an intuitive sense for recognizing who could be trusted and who couldn't. His work with the Secret Service was an unspoken part of his life, and one that he took very seriously. But it wasn't something he ever boasted about, never flaunted in interviews or public appearances. To the world, Clint Eastwood was an actor. To the people who knew the truth, he was much more, a man with a purpose far beyond fame. But what Clint didn't expect was that one day, his two worlds would collide in the most unexpected of places, a courtroom. It wasn't until the investigation involving a high-profile corruption case came to light that Clint found himself drawn back into the world of national security, albeit this time, in a way he had never imagined. The case had started off as a routine investigation, an inquiry into a powerful politician suspected of orchestrating a massive financial scheme that involved both corporate giants and government officials. But as the investigation deepened, it became clear that the web of corruption reached much further than anyone had expected. Clint had been quietly monitoring the case from the shadows, working with a small team within the Secret Service, tracking leads that were too sensitive for public knowledge. He had always been one to keep a low profile, but as the investigation progressed, it became more apparent that someone on the inside was leaking information. Trust was in short supply, and Clint's experience made him the perfect person to dive into the heart of the problem without drawing too much attention. The more Clint investigated, the more he realized that there was something far bigger at play. What had initially appeared to be a case of financial fraud was rapidly turning into a larger, more dangerous conspiracy, one that involved national security at its core. Clint had been called in to testify in the case not as an actor, but as a witness to a deeper network of corruption that he had uncovered during his covert work. The reason for his presence in the courtroom was far more critical than anyone could have imagined. He was a man with information that could bring down the very people who had once believed they were untouchable. As Clint sat in the courtroom, he could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The judge, Judge Mitchell, may have thought this was just another celebrity moment, a brief intrusion into the mundane business of his courtroom. But for Clint, this was no joke. He had something to prove, both to himself and to the country he had spent decades protecting. The truth was, Clint had been tracking the conspiracy for months. Every lead he followed, every piece of evidence he uncovered, led him closer to a figure in Washington, D.C., a politician who had risen to power through illegal means, manipulating the very system that had been put in place to serve the people. Clint had seen corruption on a small scale in his lifetime, but this was different. This was the kind of treason that could tear the country apart. And now, as Clint sat in that courtroom, he was determined to ensure that the truth came to light. He wasn't there to win any popularity contest. He wasn't there for the applause or the cameras. Clint Eastwood had one mission, to stop the corruption, expose the traitors, and protect the country he had sworn to serve. The room might have laughed at the idea of Clint Eastwood, the Hollywood tough guy, walking into their courtroom. But Clint knew something they didn't: this was no act. This was his reality. Clint sat in the courtroom, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He wasn't concerned with the murmurs of disbelief around him or the judge's still stunned expression. He had been through far worse than an awkward moment in a courtroom filled with curious onlookers. He had been in firefights, dealt with betrayals, and watched men make life-or-death decisions in the heat of the moment. This was nothing compared to the pressure he had felt in the field. But the thing about pressure is that it has a way of creeping up on you when you least expect it. And that was exactly what Clint had to remind himself of as the tension in the courtroom mounted. The judge, now clearly flustered, tried to regain his composure. "Mr. Eastwood, I apologize if I've misjudged your intentions. But you've just introduced an entirely new element into this case, and I'm afraid I'm not entirely sure what you're asking for." Clint slowly leaned forward, his piercing eyes never leaving the judge's face. "Your Honor, I'm not here to ask for anything. I'm here to make sure this case stays on track, and to help ensure that the right people are held accountable." The courtroom was silent, save for the occasional creak of chairs and soft footfalls from those who couldn't help but shift in their seats. They were all waiting for Clint to continue. The unexpected presence of the legendary actor-turned-agent had everyone on edge. The buzz had turned into something more, a mix of uncertainty and curiosity. People were beginning to realize that this wasn't just a publicity stunt. This was real. Judge Mitchell swallowed hard, running a hand over his bald head, clearly conflicted about how to proceed. Mr. Eastwood, we have procedures here. I don't need to remind you of the way a court of law operates. If you have something to say, please present it. If not, I must ask you to step aside. Clint knew the judge wasn't trying to challenge him, but rather trying to regain control of the situation. The courtroom, once his stage, had now become something else entirely. I'm here because I've seen something that could shake the very foundation of this case, Clint began, his voice low but steady. And it's bigger than anyone in this room realizes. The people behind this conspiracy are powerful, and they've already managed to silence some of the key players involved. But they won't silence me. He paused, his voice firm as he looked directly at the judge. They can't silence me. The room seemed to hold its breath. The words Clint spoke were laden with weight, and everyone in that courtroom knew he wasn't talking about a typical criminal. No, Clint Eastwood was not a man who made idle threats. There was a quiet menace to his tone that made everyone understand he meant every word. The prosecutor, a man named Henry Burke, adjusted his glasses nervously and then spoke up. Your Honor, with all due respect, Mr. Eastwood is an actor, not a witness in this case. His presence here is disrupting proceedings, and we cannot allow his fame to derail the justice system. Henry's words had a touch of frustration in them, but Clint wasn't deterred. He was used to being underestimated, both on screen and in real life. The accusation was laughable to him, and he knew that the truth had a way of revealing itself, no matter how hard people tried to suppress it. Mr. Burke, Clint responded, his voice steady, you're right about one thing, I'm not just an actor. But I'm also not here to waste anyone's time. I've been in situations where life or death depended on what we did next. This is nothing compared to that. But I've seen things. And I'm telling you, there's something more going on than what you think. There was a long pause as the room absorbed his words. A few of the jurors exchanged uncertain glances, and even the stenographer looked up from her keyboard, pausing in her work. Judge Mitchell, clearly flustered by the turn of events, banged his gavel. Order. Order in the court. His voice was louder this time, trying to reassert control. But it wasn't working. There was a strange energy in the air now, a palpable sense that something was slipping beyond the judge's grasp. Clint had been in tight situations before, too many to count, but this felt different. There was more at stake here than just another mission. He wasn't just risking his reputation or career, he was walking a fine line between the world he had left behind in Hollywood and the one he still secretly worked within. As much as Clint tried to keep his cool, he could feel the pressure mounting. And there was no turning back now. Suddenly, as if on cue, a young woman entered the courtroom, a prosecutor's assistant, with a file in her hand. She looked visibly shaken as she approached the judge's bench. She whispered something in his ear. Whatever it was, it made the judge's face pale. He leaned back in his chair, looking more disoriented than ever before. Is there a problem, Your Honor? Clint asked, his voice calm, but with a sharp edge to it. Judge Mitchell wiped his brow. Mr. Eastwood, it seems there's been an issue. A key witness in this case has disappeared. The courtroom gasped. Clint's gaze sharpened. He knew exactly what this meant. Someone had been silenced, someone with crucial information about the conspiracy. And whoever was behind it was growing bolder, more reckless. The room erupted into chaos as whispers filled the air. The assistant rushed to the side of the courtroom, but the damage had already been done. Clint, who had once been an outsider in this world of law and order, now felt more like a soldier caught in the crossfire of a war he had only recently come to understand. This wasn't just about proving the innocence or guilt of one person. This was a game of power, one that had reached the highest echelons of government. Clint Eastwood, the actor-turned-agent, had just become a player in that game. As the chaos swirled around him, Clint stood firm. He wasn't just here to testify. He wasn't just here for the courtroom drama. He was here to expose the truth. And he knew the first step was about to come, an unpredictable turn that would push the limits of everything he had ever known. The courtroom was a buzz of activity, but Clint's mind was razor-focused. The revelation that a key witness had disappeared wasn't just a random glitch in the system. It was a message. Someone didn't want the truth to come out, and they were willing to go to any length to stop it. Clint's thoughts raced. Who would have the power to make someone vanish so quickly? And why? There were only so many people who could be involved at such a high level, but now the stakes had escalated beyond what he had anticipated. As the judge tried to restore order, Clint knew that the disappearance was more than just an inconvenience to the case, it was a clear warning. He looked around the room at the faces of the other lawyers, the judge, even the bailiff. There was a sense of unease that was contagious. The energy in the room had shifted, and Clint could feel it. For Clint, this was no longer just a legal proceeding, it was a call to action. He knew that if he was going to get to the bottom of this, he would have to move fast. The conspiracy was growing, and those behind it weren't going to sit idly by while their secrets were uncovered. As the trial continued, Clint's mind wandered back to the days when he was operating in the shadows, investigating with the Secret Service. He had been in situations like this before, where one wrong move could spell disaster, but this time felt different. The people involved in this case weren't just criminals, they were well-connected, powerful individuals who had the ability to make anyone disappear, to erase anyone who threatened their carefully constructed empire. He knew it wasn't just about finding the missing witness. That was only the tip of the iceberg. If Clint was going to expose the conspiracy, he would have to dig deeper, beyond the courtroom, into the heart of the corruption itself. This wasn't just a job for the law anymore, it was a mission that Clint had to undertake alone. He spent the next few days carefully tracing every lead, working covertly, just as he had in his years with the Secret Service. Clint had a network of trusted allies in high places, people who had long respected his quiet work, even if they hadn't known the full extent of it. He called in a few favors, made some discreet inquiries, and soon, he was piecing together a more complete picture. The deeper he dug, the clearer it became, this wasn't just about money or politics. This was about a deep-rooted web of deceit and betrayal that reached into the highest offices of the government. The key witness, it turned out, had been involved in a classified operation, an operation that, if exposed, would expose not just the corruption, but a series of covert government actions that could spark a scandal unlike any the nation had ever seen. Clint knew that he was walking a fine line. One wrong move, and he could find himself entangled in something far darker than he had anticipated. But he was no stranger to danger, and as he pieced the puzzle together, he realized just how much was at stake. It wasn't just the future of this case, it was the future of the country itself. He had no choice but to push forward. He couldn't afford to hesitate. The clock was ticking, and Clint knew that if he didn't act quickly, the conspiracy would continue to spiral out of control, with more lives at risk. One night, after hours of digging through documents and making phone calls, Clint received an encrypted message from an anonymous source. The message was brief but to the point: "Meet me at the old warehouse near 3rd and Oak. Midnight. Come alone." It was exactly the kind of message Clint had seen before. A clandestine meeting in the dead of night, something that smelled like trouble, but also like the next step in unraveling the truth. With his heart racing, Clint knew he had to go. It wasn't safe to trust anyone at this point, but this was the opportunity he had been waiting for. The missing witness, the corruption, the threats, it all led here. That night, Clint made his way to the warehouse. It was an abandoned building on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place where people could disappear without a trace. As he approached, he kept his hand near the concealed weapon he always carried, ready for anything. His years in the Secret Service had taught him how to stay alert, how to expect the unexpected. He had learned how to blend into the shadows, to observe without being seen, to read a situation before it turned dangerous. The warehouse loomed ahead, dark and quiet, the faint hum of the city lights far in the distance. Clint's instincts told him that this was a trap, but he was too close to the truth to turn back now. He entered the building cautiously, his boots barely making a sound against the dusty floor. The place was eerily silent, the only sound being the creaking of the old structure. Clint moved deeper into the building, his eyes scanning the shadows, his muscles tense and ready for action. Then, he saw him, a figure standing in the far corner of the warehouse, half shrouded in darkness. The man didn't speak at first, but Clint recognized the silhouette immediately. It was one of his old contacts from his days with the Secret Service. The man's name was Henry Calloway, a former agent who had disappeared from the radar years ago. Calloway stepped forward, his face grim. "Clint," he said, his voice low. "I knew you'd come." Clint didn't waste time on pleasantries. "You've got information on the witness, don't you? And everything else that's been happening?" Calloway nodded slowly, then reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, black folder. He handed it to Clint. "This is bigger than you think. It's not just the politicians. They've been using a network of rogue agents. People inside the government who've been acting without oversight." Clint opened the folder. Inside were photos, documents, and a list of names of people who were not just suspects but key players in the corruption. Some of them were names Clint recognized from his past, people he had once trusted. "I knew it wasn't just the politicians," Clint muttered, his mind racing as he processed the information. "They've been pulling the strings from within." Calloway's face darkened. "The people behind this, whoever they are prepared to go to any length to protect their secrets. That missing witness. He knew too much. And now they've made sure he won't talk again." Clint's heart sank. This wasn't just about one case, it was about exposing an entire underground network of corruption that had been festering in the heart of the government for far too long. "I'm going to bring them down," Clint said, his voice resolute. "One way or another." Clint stood in the dim light of the warehouse, the weight of the documents heavy in his hands. The folder Calloway had given him contained not just names and evidence but the very foundation of a conspiracy that threatened to tear apart everything Clint had ever believed in. The people involved in this network, agents, politicians, and powerful individuals, had been working in the shadows for years. And now, they were pulling the strings of not just government operations but everything Clint had fought to protect during his time with the Secret Service. Clint felt his heart pound in his chest. He was so close to the truth, so close to uncovering the full scope of the conspiracy. But with every revelation came the harsh realization that the forces working against him were stronger than he had imagined. "Clint, we don't have much time," Calloway's voice broke through Clint's thoughts, pulling him back to the present. "They know you're on to them. If they catch wind of what you've got in that folder, it'll be too late." Clint looked up, meeting Calloway's eyes. The man had always been a reliable source, but now there was a vulnerability in his eyes, a sense of urgency that Clint hadn't seen before. It was clear that they were in this together now, and there was no going back. "We'll have to move fast," Clint replied, his voice firm. "I can't let this go. I won't let it go." His words felt like a vow, one he couldn't break, no matter the cost. Clint felt the cold, heavy grip of the situation sink in. But something in his gut told him that this moment, standing there with Calloway in the dark, was the turning point. This was the moment where everything changed. The truth was finally within his reach, but exposing it meant stepping into the unknown, something Clint knew all too well. "Where do we go from here?" Clint asked, his voice steady but filled with a deep sense of responsibility. Calloway hesitated, as if weighing his next words carefully. "The people behind this network, they're not just untouchable. They're protected. And it's not just through politics or money. They've embedded themselves in every corner of the government. They've got people on the inside, people we've trusted for years. I've seen how they operate. They'll do whatever it takes to keep this under wraps." Clint's grip tightened around the folder. He had seen the darkness before, the kind of people who would stop at nothing to preserve their power, their secrecy. But this was different. This wasn't just a fight for survival. This was a battle for the truth. You said they'll do whatever it takes, Clint said quietly, his voice growing cold. What does that mean, exactly? Calloway's expression darkened. It means they'll come for anyone who stands in their way. They've silenced witnesses, destroyed evidence, and eliminated anyone who might expose their operations. And now, they know you're coming for them. You'll need to be prepared for anything. Clint's pulse quickened. He had always been prepared, but now, the stakes had grown far higher than he had ever anticipated. This wasn't just about getting the bad guys. It was about taking down an entire system of corruption that had infiltrated the very institutions meant to protect the public. But Clint couldn't let fear stop him now. Fear was something he had learned to master over the years. He had to keep moving forward. This was his mission, and there was no turning back. How do we take them down? Clint asked, his voice firm. Calloway gave him a hard look. We expose them. But we need more than just the evidence in that folder. We need to bring their network into the light, to show the world exactly what they've been doing in the shadows. And to do that, we'll need allies, people who are still on the inside, people who will be willing to risk everything to bring the truth to light. Clint nodded. It was clear now, this wasn't just a legal battle. It wasn't even just a case. This was a war for the truth, and for the future of the country itself. We'll need to act fast, Clint said, his eyes steely with determination. The longer we wait, the more chance they have to cover their tracks. We can't let that happen. Calloway agreed. I'll contact some people I trust. But Clint, you need to be careful. They've got eyes everywhere, and they'll be watching you every step of the way. Clint turned, his mind already moving forward to the next steps. I've been watched before. It's not new to me. But now, it's time for them to feel the heat. As he walked out of the warehouse, Clint knew the game had just changed. The emotional toll of the situation was undeniable. The weight of the truth was heavy on his shoulders, but there was a sense of clarity now that hadn't been there before. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who would be affected by this conspiracy, people who had no idea what was happening behind the scenes, people who trusted the government, who trusted the system. He wasn't just fighting for justice. He was fighting for the soul of the nation. The night air felt colder as he stepped outside, the city lights flickering in the distance. Clint's heart raced with adrenaline, but there was a calm resolve deep inside him. He had made it this far, and there was no turning back now. He had to win. Because the truth had to come out. The air was thick with tension as Clint stared out the window of his office. The city sprawled below him, its lights twinkling like 1,000 secrets waiting to be uncovered. The information in the folder had turned everything he thought he knew upside down. The conspiracy was more extensive, more dangerous, than anything he could have imagined. But he had made a promise. He had made a vow to bring the truth to light, no matter the cost. But with every new piece of the puzzle, Clint felt the weight of the world pressing down on him. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became, this wasn't just about corruption or betrayal. It was about everything he had spent his life protecting, justice, truth, and the very foundations of democracy itself. The people behind this network weren't just criminals. They were the ones who controlled the levers of power, the ones who manipulated the system for their own gain. Clint had been to war before, but this was different. This wasn't just a fight for survival. This was a fight for the truth. And the truth had a cost. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. Clint. A voice answered on the other end. It was familiar, comforting, even, though it had been a long time since they'd spoken. Sam, it's me, Clint said. I need your help. There was a pause on the other end, a slight hesitation. What's going on, Clint? You sound serious. I am, Clint replied. I've got something big, something that's going to shake everything to its core. But I need someone I can trust to back me up. I'm going after them, whoever they are. And I need to be sure I've got people watching my back. I can't do this alone. Sam, Clint's old partner from his time in the Secret Service, exhaled heavily. Clint could hear the sound of papers shuffling, the telltale sign that Sam was processing everything. All right, Clint. You know I don't ask questions. But you need to be careful. These people you're going after, this isn't just any case. They've got power, influence, and resources you can't even begin to fathom. It's not just about exposing the truth anymore. It's about surviving long enough to tell it. Clint's hand tightened around the phone. I know, Sam. I know. But I've come this far. I can't stop now. If I do, it'll all be for nothing. There was a long silence on the line. Then, Sam spoke, his voice low but resolute. I'm in. You've got my support. Let's finish this. Clint felt a wave of relief wash over him. Sam was one of the few people Clint trusted completely. If anyone could help him navigate the perilous journey ahead, it was Sam. They spent the next few hours making plans, strategizing every move down to the smallest detail. They couldn't afford to make a mistake. Not now, not when they were so close. By the time Clint hung up, the night had fallen, and the weight of the task ahead was heavier than ever. He had the truth in his hands. But exposing it would be the hardest thing he had ever done. The people behind this conspiracy were ruthless, driven by power, greed, and a desire to control everything. And Clint knew that they would stop at nothing to silence him. The next morning, Clint met with a small group of trusted allies. Some were former colleagues from his days with the Secret Service, others were people he had met along the way, journalists, activists, and even former government insiders who had seen enough to know that something needed to change. They all understood the stakes. This wasn't just about a corrupt few individuals, it was about the survival of the integrity of the system. All right, here's the plan, Clint said, standing at the head of the table. He laid out the evidence he had gathered, photos, documents, encrypted communications, and a list of names. We need to expose the entire network. These people have been hiding in plain sight, and it's time to shine a light on their corruption. One of the journalists at the table, a sharp-eyed woman named Emily, leaned forward. You're talking about bringing down some of the most powerful people in the country. They're going to come after us, Clint. We have to be ready for anything. Clint nodded. He knew the risks. He had known them from the start. But he couldn't back down. Not now. Not when the truth was finally within reach. We're ready, Clint said firmly. I've got Sam on the inside working with us. We've got the evidence, and we've got the leverage. It's just a matter of getting it out there. Another member of the group, a former government agent named Luis, added, the media will be our biggest ally. We need to ensure they have the story, all the details, before anyone has a chance to stop us. Clint glanced around the room at his team. There was no turning back now. Every person in that room understood the gravity of what they were about to do. They were about to tear down an empire of corruption. But it wouldn't be easy. As they worked out the final details of the plan, Clint's mind drifted back to the moment in the warehouse when he had first realized how deep the conspiracy went. It was a sobering thought, knowing how many lives were tied to this. There were good people at risk, people who had been manipulated, threatened, and silenced by a network that had built its empire on fear and deceit. But the more Clint thought about it, the more certain he became. He wasn't just fighting for the truth. He was fighting for the future of this country, for the people who had no idea how deep the corruption ran. This fight wasn't just for him, it was for everyone who had ever believed in justice, in the rule of law, in what was right. The moment they had all been preparing for arrived sooner than expected. Clint received an encrypted message. His allies had gathered the last bit of evidence they needed, and it was time to go public. It was now or never. They had one shot at this. One chance to make the truth known, and expose the corruption that had hidden in the shadows for so long. Clint's heart raced, but his resolve was unwavering. He knew what was at stake. The fight wasn't over yet, but it had reached the final stretch. The truth would come to light, and those who had manipulated the system for their own gain would finally be held accountable. With one last glance at his team, Clint nodded. "Let's do this." The press conference room was filled with the hum of low conversations and the sound of cameras adjusting. Clint felt the weight of the moment bearing down on him, each second feeling heavier than the last. This wasn't just any press conference. This was his chance to expose everything, the conspiracy, the corruption, and the people who had been manipulating the system for their own gain. This was the moment where the truth would either be set free or buried for good. Clint stood at the front of the room, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the low murmur of the reporters behind him, the anticipation in the air thick enough to cut through with a knife. The world was about to find out everything. "Mr. Eastwood," a voice called from the crowd, interrupting the tension. Clint turned to face the reporter who had spoken. "Are you certain about these accusations? Are you sure you have the evidence to back them up?" Clint met the reporter's gaze without hesitation. "I am absolutely sure. The evidence is irrefutable. And I will show you everything. These people have been operating in the shadows, manipulating the very systems that are supposed to protect us. But no more. The truth is coming out today." A few reporters exchanged skeptical looks, but Clint's words were firm. He had made his decision, and there was no going back. This was a fight for the soul of the nation, and he wouldn't let the truth be silenced. Behind him, Calloway stood, his expression unreadable. Emily, the journalist who had helped gather the evidence, gave him a small nod, signaling that everything was in place. The media outlets had received encrypted copies of the documents Clint had gathered. The names, the hidden transactions, the secret meetings, it was all laid bare. Clint took a deep breath and stepped forward, the room falling silent as he clicked on the projector. The first image flashed on the screen, a list of names, high-ranking government officials, business moguls, and former intelligence officers. They were all linked together by a web of corruption and deceit. The room buzzed as the reporters whispered among themselves, their voices tinged with disbelief. "This is just the beginning," Clint said, his voice calm but unwavering. "These are the people who have been pulling the strings from behind the scenes. But the truth isn't just about names. It's about what they've done, the lives they've ruined, the people they've betrayed." He clicked the projector again, and more images appeared, photographs of covert meetings, encrypted messages, financial records showing illegal transactions. Every piece of evidence he had gathered was there, on display for the world to see. It was undeniable. There was no way to hide from the truth now. The room was electric with activity, reporters scrambling to take notes, photographers snapping pictures. Clint felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. He had been preparing for this moment for so long, but now that it was here, he realized that it wasn't just the evidence that mattered, it was the message. This was about holding the powerful accountable, about reminding the world that no one was above the law. As Clint continued, he could see the shock and disbelief on the faces of the reporters in the room. Some were stunned into silence, others were scrambling to gather information for their stories. But Clint's focus was on one thing, making sure the world understood the full scope of what had been done. "This is not just about exposing a few corrupt individuals," Clint said, his voice growing stronger. "This is about exposing an entire system, one that has been built on lies and manipulation. It's about justice, and it's about accountability. And I won't stop until every last one of them is held responsible for their actions." For a moment, Clint paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. The room was silent, every eye on him. He had said what needed to be said, and now it was out there. The truth was no longer a secret. The question was, what would happen next? Suddenly, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Clint glanced at it quickly, his heart skipped a beat. It was a message from Sam. "They're moving in on you. Be ready. They won't let this go without a fight." Clint's pulse quickened, but he kept his composure. The battle was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. "I know what you're thinking," Clint said, looking directly at the crowd. "Some of you might be questioning how it's possible that these people, these so-called leaders, could get away with something so egregious for so long. Well, that's the problem. They've had power, and they've used it to cover their tracks. But today, we're changing that. Today, they answer for their actions." Clint's eyes scanned the room, meeting the gaze of several reporters. He could see the wheels turning in their heads as they processed the information, as they realized just how deep this conspiracy went. There was no turning back now. The truth was out. The world was watching. But Clint knew the risks. He had known from the moment he stepped into this fight that exposing the truth wouldn't be easy. He had expected pushback, but this was different. Now, there were people who would do anything to stop him. The game had changed, and the stakes had never been higher. As Clint wrapped up the press conference, he felt the familiar rush of adrenaline surge through him. This was what he had been fighting for all along. This wasn't just about personal redemption or bringing criminals to justice. This was about making sure the truth won out. He turned to Calloway, his expression grim. "We've got to move fast. They'll try to bury this. We need to get the story out before they can stop it." Calloway nodded. "We've got backup, Clint. It's not just the media we're relying on. The evidence is already out there. The public has seen it. The pressure's on now." But Clint knew that pressure would only escalate. The people he was up against wouldn't go down without a fight. They would do everything they could to silence him, to erase the evidence, to turn the narrative in their favor. The next few days were a blur of media appearances, interviews, and phone calls. The story spread like wildfire, but Clint knew it wasn't enough. He had exposed them, but now he had to make sure they didn't disappear into the shadows again. With every new revelation, the opposition grew fiercer. The pressure on Clint and his team intensified, and the risks they had taken to expose the conspiracy became more apparent. But Clint was resolute. The truth would prevail. He had come too far to let them win. The final showdown was coming. And Clint was ready. The following days were a whirlwind. Clint had always known that bringing the truth to light would stir up a storm, but nothing could have prepared him for the sheer force of the backlash. The people behind the conspiracy didn't just want to silence him, they wanted to erase the entire story, bury it so deep that no one would ever remember it. They had resources, connections, and influence in every corner of the government and the media. They were playing a game with stakes far higher than Clint had ever imagined. The first wave of attacks came from the press. Many of the outlets that had initially picked up the story began to question the validity of Clint's claims. They were being inundated with calls from high-ranking officials, corporate elites, and those with deep pockets who wanted to see the story buried. Doubts were planted, and questions arose. Was Clint really telling the truth? Could the evidence he presented be manipulated? Clint had expected this. He knew the media landscape was a battlefield, and he had prepared himself for the smear campaign that would inevitably follow. But it was harder than he'd anticipated. It felt like every time he took a step forward, he was pushed 2 steps back. "I don't care about the media's spin," Clint said one morning, slamming his fist down on the table in his office. "I care about the truth. And we're not backing down." Sam, his old partner from the Secret Service, leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. He was clearly concerned, but Clint knew his friend had been through enough fights to understand the stakes. Sam had always been the calm, steady force in their partnership, but now he was showing the strain of the war they were fighting. "Clint, we can't just fight with the truth," Sam said, his voice low. "These people are playing a different game. They'll discredit you, use every weapon at their disposal to turn this against you. We need more than just a good story, we need a strategy." Clint knew Sam was right. They couldn't just rely on their evidence alone. It wasn't enough to have the truth if the world wasn't willing to listen. He had been hoping for the public to rally around the cause, but the deeper he dug, the clearer it became: the conspiracy ran too deep, and the opposition was too powerful. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to think of his next move. "So what do we do?" "We fight fire with fire," Sam replied, walking over to Clint's desk and spreading out a map of the city, highlighting key locations. "We know who's behind this. We've got contacts, intel that goes beyond just the press. We need to hit them where it hurts, by exposing their network, cutting off their resources, and forcing them to act before they can silence us completely." Clint's mind raced. "We need more than just names. We need to hit them financially, strategically. If we expose their money trail, their influence, we'll be able to force their hand." Sam nodded. "Exactly. And we have to move fast. The longer we wait, the more they'll have time to clean up their mess. We can't afford that." They spent the next several hours working together, meticulously piecing together the last of the evidence they needed to expose the full extent of the conspiracy. Clint had gathered intel on several shell companies, corrupt financial transactions, and high-level connections between corporate executives and government officials. But they needed more to break through the wall of silence that had been erected around them. Clint reached out to Emily, the journalist who had been a key player in bringing the story to light. He knew she had contacts who could help them get access to the more secure parts of the investigation, the information that hadn't made it into the public eye yet. "Emily, we need everything you've got," Clint said, his voice urgent. "We can't let this slip through the cracks. We need to make them sweat." Emily's voice crackled on the line. "I've got your back, Clint. I'm digging deeper. I'll have more information for you soon." Clint hung up and turned to Sam, who was already on the phone with one of their old contacts in law enforcement. It was all coming together. Slowly, but surely, they were getting closer to the heart of the conspiracy. But even as they made progress, Clint knew that every move they made brought them closer to danger. The opposition wasn't sitting idly by. They had resources at their disposal: private investigators, hackers, people who could track their every move and discredit them at a moment's notice. Clint couldn't afford to make a mistake. Later that afternoon, Clint met with Calloway in a quiet cafe, away from prying eyes. The pressure was beginning to take its toll on both of them, but Calloway's calm demeanor was a steadying influence. They had been working together for years, and Clint trusted him with his life. "Clint, the pressure's building," Calloway said, sliding a folder across the table. "We're seeing more pushback. The conspiracy's doing everything they can to discredit us. You've got some people in your corner, but it's not enough. We need to turn the tide." Clint flipped open the folder, scanning the new information that Calloway had provided. It was a list of high-ranking officials who were involved in the cover-up, as well as several corporate executives who had helped launder the money that had been funneled into the illicit operations. "We need to leak this," Clint said, his voice low. "We need to get this into the public's hands. The truth has to come out, and it has to come out now." Calloway raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure? If we release this, there's no turning back. The backlash will be immediate. You'll be painted as a whistleblower with a vendetta." "I don't care," Clint replied, his voice sharp. "If they want to paint me as the villain, fine. I'll wear it. But the truth is going to come out. We're doing this, and we're doing it now." With a decisive nod, Calloway reached for his phone, ready to set the plan in motion. Clint could feel the weight of the moment, knowing that this was their final chance. If they didn't act quickly, they could lose everything. But Clint's resolve was unshakable. The truth had to win, no matter the cost. The following days passed in a blur of intensity. Clint could feel the pressure mounting with each passing hour. The conspiracy that had seemed so distant and abstract was now an all-consuming force, twisting every interaction, every decision. It was as if the world itself had tilted, and Clint was standing at the precipice, watching everything shift beneath him. Clint's phone had been ringing non-stop, calls from reporters, calls from allies, and worst of all, calls from people trying to warn him. The more he dug, the more he realized just how deep the web of corruption went. They were everywhere, across government agencies, corporate boardrooms, and even in the shadows of the media. No one was safe. And no one was innocent. It was in the quiet moments, between the chaos, that Clint started to feel the weight of what he was asking of those around him. His team. His friends. Even Calloway, who had always been steadfast in his support, seemed strained, worn down by the magnitude of the fight they were waging. Sam was still with him, of course, always there, always steady, but Clint could tell that his partner was becoming more and more concerned about their safety. They had been targeted, there was no denying it. There were too many eyes watching them. Too many threats lurking in the background. One evening, after another grueling day of meetings and strategy sessions, Clint found himself sitting alone in his office, staring out the window at the city below. The sun was setting, casting an amber glow over the skyline, but Clint couldn't bring himself to enjoy the view. Instead, his mind kept racing through the same thoughts, questions without answers, decisions without clarity. He rubbed his temples, trying to stave off the headache that had been building all day. This was the part of the battle Clint hated the most, the waiting. The time when they didn't know what would happen next. It was a constant dance, moving and reacting, unsure of where the next blow would come from. There was a knock at the door, and Clint looked up, startled. It was Calloway, his face tight with concern. "We need to talk," Calloway said, stepping inside without waiting for a response. Clint leaned back in his chair, feeling a sense of unease settle in his stomach. "What's going on?" Calloway closed the door behind him and took a seat across from Clint. "We've got a problem. Someone leaked the information we sent to the press." Clint's heart sank. "What do you mean, leaked?" "Exactly what I said," Calloway replied. "Someone got a hold of the documents we were going to release, and now the opposition is spinning them into something else. They're framing you as a whistleblower with an axe to grind, trying to discredit the entire story." Clint's blood ran cold. He had been expecting something like this, but to hear it confirmed was another matter entirely. "How? How did they get the information?" "I don't know," Calloway said, frustration evident in his voice. "But it's out there now. The narrative is already shifting. They're going after your credibility, Clint. And they're not stopping." Clint leaned forward, his fists clenched. "So what's the plan?" "We need to act fast," Calloway said. "The longer we wait, the more they control the story. We can't let them hijack this. If we're going to expose them, we have to go on the offensive, bring more heat to the table, force them into a corner." Clint thought for a moment, his mind racing through options. He could feel the familiar adrenaline surge. This was what he did, this was his fight. And he wasn't going to back down now. "We need to push harder," Clint said, standing up and pacing. "We'll release everything we have, but we need to be strategic. We'll leak the financial records next. The ones showing the offshore accounts. The connections to the underworld. It's time we hit them where it hurts." Calloway raised an eyebrow. "You're sure about this? Once we release that kind of information, there's no turning back. You'll be painted as the villain for good." Clint paused, looking out the window again. "I'm not worried about how they'll paint me. I'm worried about getting this out. The people need to see the full picture. And if they want to destroy me in the process, let them. They'll see who the real criminals are." Calloway gave him a hard look but nodded in agreement. All right, Clint. Let's get it done. As the next days unfolded, Clint and his team worked tirelessly to prepare for the next phase of their plan. They knew they had to act quickly, as the opposition was growing desperate to control the narrative. The release of the financial records was a risky move, but Clint knew it was their best shot at forcing the conspirators into the open. Emily had been instrumental in gathering the financial data. She had contacts deep within the financial world who had helped her dig up the secret accounts and transactions that linked the conspirators to criminal enterprises. The documents were meticulously organized, and Clint knew that once the public saw the connections, there would be no way for the opposition to deny their involvement. Sam and Calloway were working behind the scenes to ensure that the leak was handled securely, so that the information wouldn't be intercepted or manipulated. They were taking no chances. This had to be perfect. The final piece of the puzzle came when Clint received a call from an unexpected source, an anonymous whistleblower who claimed to have direct knowledge of the conspiracy's inner workings. The whistleblower provided Clint with the smoking gun, the final piece of evidence that would tie everything together. "Clint, I've got it," the voice on the phone said, shaky but urgent. "I know who's been pulling the strings from the beginning. It's bigger than you think. You're not just up against a few bad actors. This goes all the way to the top." Clint's pulse quickened. "Tell me everything." The whistleblower hesitated for a moment, then began to speak. What Clint heard next sent a chill down his spine. The conspiracy wasn't just about corruption in government and business. It was a carefully orchestrated network, spanning continents and involving people with power beyond Clint's wildest imagination. This was no longer just a local fight. This was global. And Clint was about to go up against the most dangerous players in the world. The hours after the whistleblower's call were a blur. Clint felt as if the ground beneath him had shifted, and now he was standing on unstable, dangerous terrain. The scope of the conspiracy had widened beyond anything he had imagined. What had started as a corrupt network of local officials and corporate elites now seemed to involve powerful international figures with far-reaching influence. This wasn't just a fight for truth, it was a battle against a global system of corruption. The stakes had never been higher. Clint couldn't just expose a few crooked politicians and businessmen anymore. The people behind this were too entrenched, too dangerous, and they would stop at nothing to protect their empire. If they wanted to silence him, they would. They had the means, the power, and the money to do so. And yet, Clint knew there was no turning back. The truth had to be exposed, no matter the cost. He had already made sacrifices, personal, professional, and the ones to come would only add to the weight of his choices. But he was determined. There was no price too high when it came to the truth. In the early hours of the morning, Clint and his team gathered for what felt like the final strategy session. They had prepared everything, but now they had to decide when and how to strike. The decision wasn't simple. Leaking the financial records was one thing, but revealing the identities of the powerful players involved, people with international connections, was a risk Clint wasn't sure he was ready to take. Sitting around the table in the dimly lit room, Clint looked at each person. Sam, Emily, and Calloway were all there, their faces drawn with exhaustion but resolute. The weight of their shared mission was palpable. "We have the evidence," Clint said, his voice firm. "The whistleblower has given us the final piece we need. But this is no longer just about exposing corruption in one country. This is global. We're about to target the most powerful people in the world. Are we ready for this?" Calloway leaned forward, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. "We don't have a choice, Clint. They've already made their move. We release this, or we lose everything. And I mean everything." Emily nodded, her expression steely. "We've come too far. If we don't act now, they'll bury this. They'll bury us." Sam, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke up. His voice was steady, but there was a seriousness in his tone that Clint had come to respect over the years. "I've always had your back, Clint. You know that," Sam said, locking eyes with his partner. "But this is bigger than anything we've ever faced. If we go through with this, there's no going back. We're all in this together, but the consequences could be severe." Clint felt the weight of his words. Sam was right. They had crossed a line that few ever dared to approach. But Clint's resolve didn't waver. He had made peace with the fact that this was a battle for truth, and battles like this didn't come without casualties. "I'm not afraid of the consequences," Clint said, his voice unwavering. "We do this now, or we lose everything we've worked for. We expose them for what they are, and we let the world decide. This is our moment." Calloway stood up, his hands moving quickly as he accessed the secure network they had set up for the leak. "We release the financial records first. Then, we drop the whistleblower's information. It'll hit hard and fast, and they won't have time to react." Clint nodded. "Let's do it." The next few hours were a blur of activity. They pushed the final pieces of the plan into motion, securing all the necessary links and ensuring that their sources were protected. It was a delicate operation. If they slipped up even once, everything would be compromised. Emily worked feverishly, coordinating with her network of journalists to ensure the story would spread like wildfire once the documents were released. Sam and Calloway continued to monitor the progress, making sure the leak went smoothly without attracting unwanted attention. And Clint? He was sitting at his desk, watching the clock tick down, his mind racing. Every instinct told him they were on the edge of something monumental, something that could change the course of history. But there was no going back now. At precisely 3 a.m., the first wave of the information was released. The financial records went live, along with detailed documents showing the money trail leading from corrupt officials to international criminal syndicates. It was a bombshell. Clint watched the initial reactions unfold on his computer screen. Media outlets began picking up the story, and social media was abuzz with outrage. But then, less than an hour later, the second wave hit, the whistleblower's testimony. It was the final nail in the coffin. The identities of the key players, those who had orchestrated the entire conspiracy, were revealed. The public was stunned. The revelations came in rapid succession, and the truth was undeniable. The people responsible for the corruption, the lies, and the crimes were now exposed for the world to see. Clint watched as the world reacted. There was no going back. The story was out. The conspiracy had been laid bare. It was as if a dam had burst, flooding the world with the truth. But in the midst of the chaos, something unexpected happened. Clint's phone buzzed with an incoming call. The name on the screen made his heart skip a beat. It was the judge, the same one who had laughed at Clint when he had first stepped into court. Clint had never expected to hear from her again, especially not after everything that had happened. He hesitated before answering, his mind racing. "Clint," the judge said, her voice tight. "We need to talk." Clint's pulse quickened. "What's going on?" "You need to be careful," the judge warned, her voice low. "This is bigger than you think. The people you've exposed, they're not going to stop. You've made powerful enemies, Clint. You have to watch your back. You've unleashed something you can't control." Clint's grip on the phone tightened. "I know what I'm doing. And I'm not backing down." The line went silent for a moment, and Clint could almost hear the judge weighing her words carefully. "Just make sure you're ready for what's coming next," she said before hanging up. Clint stood there, staring at the phone in his hand, his mind racing. He had known the risks. But now, it felt as if the world had changed forever. And Clint was at the center of it all. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The next few days passed in a blur of chaos and uncertainty. Clint could feel the shifting tides, but in the immediate aftermath of the information leak, there was an unsettling stillness. It was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. The conspiracy had been exposed, but Clint knew this was only the beginning. The storm was far from over. He sat in his office late one evening, surrounded by stacks of documents and reports. The initial reactions to the leaks had been explosive. Media outlets had been scrambling to cover the story, journalists were digging deeper into the financial records, and social media was alive with fervent discussions. The sheer magnitude of the revelations was undeniable, and the public was hungry for more. But Clint had no illusions. As much as the truth had come out, the forces behind the conspiracy were far from finished. They would retaliate. They always did. He leaned back in his chair, massaging his temples. His head was pounding from the constant stress, but he couldn't afford to let his guard down. He had to stay focused. The phone on his desk buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was a secure call, the kind he had grown accustomed to. Clint answered it without hesitation. "Clint, it's Calloway," the voice on the other end crackled. "We've got a problem." Clint's heart skipped a beat. "What's happened?" "We've been compromised. Someone's been trying to track our movements, through the network. I don't know how they found us, but we're being watched. We need to move fast." Clint's mind raced. He had known this day would come. They had taken every precaution, but nothing was foolproof. "What's the plan?" "We need to go dark," Calloway replied. "We've got to cut all communication and get out of the building. They've got eyes on us." Clint stood up, pacing the room. "How bad is it?" "Bad," Calloway said, his voice sharp. "This isn't just some small-time operation. We're talking about a global network, Clint. They're coming for us. We need to be ahead of the game if we want to survive this." Clint's stomach tightened. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "All right. Get everyone out. I'll meet you at the secure location in 20 minutes. "Understood." As Clint hung up the phone, he didn't waste another second. He grabbed the encrypted hard drive with all the evidence, shoving it into his bag. It was the most important thing he owned right now, the key to everything. If the opposition got their hands on it, the game would be over. They couldn't let that happen. He made his way to the elevator, keeping his movements deliberately calm. But inside, his mind was working furiously. He had been expecting a retaliation, but it was happening faster than he'd anticipated. The conspirators weren't just trying to protect their interests, they were coming after him personally. As he stepped into the parking garage, Clint scanned the area for any signs of danger. It was eerily quiet, too quiet. His instincts were on high alert, and his hand hovered over the concealed weapon he kept with him at all times. The last thing he wanted was a confrontation, but he couldn't afford to take any chances. The car ride to the secure location felt like an eternity. Every passing vehicle seemed suspicious, every shadow seemed too dark. Clint kept his eyes peeled, waiting for something, anything, that would signal an ambush. When he arrived at the location, a nondescript building on the outskirts of the city, Clint quickly made his way inside. Sam, Emily, and Calloway were already there, waiting for him. The tension in the room was palpable. "What's the status?" Clint asked, his voice low. Calloway quickly briefed him. "We've already started moving the data. We've got people in place to secure the evidence, but we don't have long. We've been compromised too many times already. They'll find us, Clint. It's only a matter of time." Clint nodded, his mind racing. "We need to be ready. We can't afford to slip up now. We have to push forward, no matter what." Emily was already at a computer, typing rapidly. "I've got a list of safe houses, alternate routes. If we need to disappear, we can. But we need a plan for the next move." Clint walked over to her, leaning over her shoulder as she worked. What's the next step? We can't just hide forever. Emily hesitated for a moment before responding. I think it's time we go on the offensive. We've exposed the financial ties, but we haven't hit them where it counts yet. The connections to the criminal underworld are just the tip of the iceberg. There are bigger players involved, politicians, foreign governments. It's time to expose the entire network. Clint looked at her, his expression serious. You're suggesting we go public with all of it? Yes, Emily replied. We can't hold back anymore. The longer we wait, the more time they have to cover their tracks. If we release everything, every last piece of information, we can force their hand. Clint stood still for a moment, weighing her words. It was a risky move, but the only other option was to let them bury the truth. And Clint wasn't willing to let that happen. We do it, Clint said, his voice determined. We release it all. The team worked quickly, each of them taking on specific roles to ensure the leak went off without a hitch. Sam and Calloway worked on securing alternate communication lines while Emily focused on coordinating with trusted journalists. Clint, meanwhile, sat back, deep in thought. He knew that once the information went public, there would be no going back. He thought about the judge's warning, the same judge who had once dismissed him with a laugh in the courtroom. You've unleashed something you can't control, she had said. Clint hadn't understood it then, but now he did. This wasn't just about exposing a few corrupt officials. This was a battle against a system that had controlled everything for far too long. Clint was about to take the final step in his quest for truth. And as much as it terrified him, he was ready. The next morning felt different. The air itself seemed to crackle with anticipation. Clint had crossed a line. No longer could he afford to be cautious or hesitate. The evidence was ready, the moment had come, and now all he had to do was push the button. But as Clint paced the room, waiting for the final preparations to fall into place, the weight of it all hit him. There was no more hiding. No more safety nets. Once the truth was out there, it would be up to the world to decide what came next. And no matter how much he wanted justice, Clint couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he was playing right into someone else's hands. The media had been buzzing since the leak, but it wasn't enough. He needed them to see the full scope of what he had uncovered. The corruption that stretched across borders, that tied powerful figures together, international leaders, corporate moguls, criminal syndicates. The moment that truth dropped, there would be no turning back. The dominoes would fall, and everything they had fought for would be out in the open. Clint sat at the makeshift command center the team had set up in the safe house. Emily was speaking in hushed tones on the phone with an anonymous source. Sam was at a computer, typing furiously, his brow furrowed in concentration. Calloway was pacing back and forth, clearly on edge. They all knew what was at stake. Clint knew they had to hit them hard and fast, and as soon as the information was out there, they had to be ready to move again. He looked at the team, taking a deep breath before breaking the silence. We release everything, he said, his voice steady, but there was an edge to it now, an edge that came from realizing that this was it. There was no second chance. Emily's eyes met his. She had been working non-stop for days, and Clint could see the exhaustion in her face, but there was also something else, resolve. She nodded, then turned back to the phone. It's set. The first round of the leak will go live in 30 minutes. That's when the world will see the full scope of the conspiracy. After that, the whistleblower's testimony will drop. Clint swallowed hard. This could destroy everything, Emily. You know that, right? She didn't flinch. It could. But the alternative is worse. We've been fighting against a system that's been in place for decades. If we don't do this, it'll never change. People need to see what's happening behind the curtain. Clint's gaze shifted toward Calloway, who had paused in his pacing, his face grim. Are we sure we've covered all our bases? Once this goes public, they'll come after us. We need to be ahead of them, or we won't make it out of this. Everything's in place, Sam chimed in, looking up from his computer screen. We've got backups, escape routes, alternate plans. We've thought of everything, Clint. Clint nodded, but the feeling of unease didn't leave him. He wasn't afraid of what might happen to him. But the people closest to him, his team, he couldn't help but feel responsible for them. Every choice they made was a choice that might change their lives forever. His phone buzzed again. It was a text message from the judge. He didn't recognize the number, but there was no mistaking the urgency of her words. You don't know the full extent of what you're dealing with. Be ready for the backlash. They won't stop until they've destroyed everything. Clint read the message several times, his mind racing. He had known the risks. He had known that the conspirators would fight back, but this? This wasn't just about covering their tracks anymore. They were going to war. He didn't respond to the judge's message. There was no time for more distractions. The plan had been set. The leak was going live in 30 minutes, and they had no choice but to ride it out. 30 minutes later, Clint sat at the head of the table, watching as the team finalized the last details. Sam and Calloway were tracking the online reactions in real time, while Emily was liaising with journalists to ensure the story would reach as many people as possible. This was it, the moment that could change everything. Clint felt his pulse quicken as the countdown on the computer screen ticked down to 0. The first wave of information hit, and instantly, everything changed. News outlets around the world picked up the story, broadcasting the damning evidence for all to see. Twitter exploded, Facebook lit up with discussions, and soon, the hashtag #TruthExposed was trending worldwide. Clint watched as the shockwaves rippled across the globe. But even as the world seemed to be reacting, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The reactions were almost too controlled, too predictable. The system of corruption that had once seemed so enormous now appeared to be taking everything in stride. As the first round of revelations were consumed by the media, Clint began to wonder if they had underestimated their opponents. They had thought that releasing the information would send shockwaves through the power structure, that it would destabilize the criminal empire they were up against. But instead, the more Clint watched the unfolding events, the more it seemed as though someone had been prepared for this. The second wave, the whistleblower's testimony, was about to drop. Get ready, Emily said, glancing nervously at the clock. This is the moment. But before they could proceed, Calloway's voice interrupted. His expression had turned to one of concern. Clint, you need to see this. Clint stood and walked over to Calloway's screen, his stomach dropping as he saw the latest news report. A statement from one of the implicated officials had just been released. It was calm, collected, and dismissive of the leaks. The official claimed that the documents were forgeries, that the testimonies were fabricated. They even had a counternarrative ready, claiming that the whistleblower was a disgruntled former employee with an agenda. The statement was backed by several international organizations, and it was gaining traction fast. They're controlling the narrative, Clint muttered under his breath. They were prepared for this. They've spun it, and now they're using it to discredit us. This isn't just a smear campaign, Calloway replied, his voice tight with frustration. They're making it look like the whole thing is a hoax. And the media's buying into it. Clint gritted his teeth, his fists clenching at his sides. No. This isn't over. We go with the second wave. We can't let them twist the truth. The second wave, containing the whistleblower's testimony and irrefutable evidence, was ready to go. Clint wasn't going to let them win. Not now. Not after everything. As the team prepared to release the second wave, Clint couldn't help but feel the weight of the decision. The world was watching, and whatever happened next would determine the course of the coming days, weeks, and possibly years. But Clint had no illusions anymore. There was no turning back. He had already chosen his path. And he would see it through to the end. The digital clock on the wall flickered from 11:59 p.m. to 12 a.m. The second wave of the leak was about to drop, and Clint could feel his heart pounding in his chest. There was no turning back now. The world had seen the first wave, but it wasn't enough. They needed more. The truth needed to be undeniable. Emily, Sam, and Calloway were gathered around the room, tense and on edge. They all knew the risks. The media had already started to push back against the leaks, spinning stories about forgeries, fakes, and smear tactics. The first round of evidence had barely made a dent in the conspiracy's well-oiled machine. "This is it," Clint said, his voice cutting through the tension. "We release it all. No half measures." Emily nodded, her hands hovering over the keyboard. "It's ready. I'm sending it out now." Clint stood by, his gaze shifting to the screens in front of them. The countdown for the second release was ticking down. Every second felt like an eternity. The whistleblower's full testimony, along with encrypted files containing irrefutable evidence, was about to go public. If this didn't shake the system to its core, nothing would. As Emily hit the send button, Clint held his breath. The files were out there, now circulating across the internet at lightning speed. They were all visible now, the connections, the illegal deals, the government officials, the CEOs, and the international syndicates. The conspiracy had nowhere to hide. The reactions came in a flood. Within moments, news outlets were forced to respond, scrambling to verify the authenticity of the new material. But the momentum was undeniable. The leaks were real, the evidence was there, and now the world had no choice but to confront the truth. But just as Clint began to feel a glimmer of hope, the phone on the table buzzed. It was an encrypted message. "Clint, you've made a terrible mistake." He opened the message with a sinking feeling in his stomach. The sender's identity was hidden, but the tone was unmistakable. A threat. The message continued, "The consequences of your actions will ripple through the entire system. We are prepared. You won't survive this. Your team won't either." Clint's fingers tightened around the phone. His first instinct was to dismiss it as empty bluster, but deep down, he knew better. The conspirators had resources, they had influence, and they had the ability to make people disappear. This wasn't a warning, they were coming for him. He turned to his team, who were still watching the flood of media responses. Sam's face had gone pale, his eyes wide with concern. "Clint, we've got a problem. The second wave, it's already being discredited. The officials are denying everything. They're calling it a targeted attack by political enemies, that it's all a setup." Clint's stomach churned. He knew that was coming. The opposition was too powerful, too organized to be caught off guard by the leak. They had contingency plans in place. The media was already taking their side, pushing narratives that framed Clint and his team as mere pawns in a much larger political game. "This is exactly what I feared," Clint muttered, his mind racing. "They're controlling the narrative. It's not about the truth anymore. It's about spinning this in their favor." Emily's eyes were glued to her screen. "We need to go public, Clint. We can't let them control the message. If we don't act now, they'll have the upper hand." Clint ran a hand through his hair. The situation was spiraling out of control. Every move they made seemed to be anticipated, countered before they could even execute it. It was as if they were playing chess against a master strategist, and they were already 2 moves behind. "We can't just go public with the truth anymore," Clint said, a hint of desperation creeping into his voice. "We need more than that. We need to expose them completely. If we don't show the entire structure of their operation, we'll never bring them down." Calloway, who had been silently observing, spoke up. "We need leverage. They've been discrediting us for days, but there's something they're hiding. A detail they haven't accounted for yet. We dig deeper, we find it, and we make it public. We can't just throw more files at the media, we need to give them something they can't refute. Clint's mind flashed to the one thing they hadn't explored yet, the missing piece of the puzzle. The connection between the conspiracy and the highest echelons of power. The government. If they could expose that, the entire operation would crumble. But to do that, they needed access to classified government data, information hidden in plain sight. They needed to get inside the system and find the key evidence that would connect the conspiracy to the people who had the power to destroy them. That's it, Clint said, his voice steely with resolve. We go after the core. The government officials who are pulling the strings. We need to get the files from inside. We infiltrate, we expose, and we take them down from within. Emily looked up from her screen, her expression conflicted. You're talking about a full-scale operation. We're not just releasing files anymore. We'll have to break into the system, Clint. We'll be going against the most powerful people in the world. Clint met her gaze, unflinching. We've already crossed that line. Now we push forward. The team spent the next few hours planning their next move. They had always known the stakes were high, but now it was personal. Every plan, every move they made, carried the weight of not just their own survival, but the fate of the country, maybe even the world. The conspiracy had dug in its heels, but Clint knew that the deeper they went, the more dangerous things would become. By the time dawn broke, Clint had a new resolve. They weren't going to hide anymore. They weren't going to let the corrupt powers continue to play their games. They were going to take them down. And Clint would lead them to victory, or he would die trying. As Clint watched the sun rise, casting a pale orange glow across the horizon, he knew the worst was yet to come. The forces they were up against were coming for them. But Clint had no intention of backing down. The real battle was just beginning. The morning light was a stark contrast to the darkness inside Clint's mind. He stood by the window of the safe house, staring at the world outside. The city was waking up, people going about their morning routines, oblivious to the seismic shift that had just occurred. Clint's team was ready, but he knew what they were about to do would change everything. It was no longer about exposing the truth, it was about survival. Clint, Emily's voice broke through his thoughts. We've got a line into the government systems. Sam and I just set up a backdoor to the encrypted files we need. But we don't have much time. Clint turned to face her, nodding grimly. The moment was upon them, and there was no more room for hesitation. The team had made arrangements, had done their research. But infiltrating the most secure government systems in the world was a job for experts, and even then, there was no guarantee they'd make it out unscathed. How long until we have the files? Clint asked, his voice steady despite the pressure mounting inside him. 15 minutes, max, Sam replied from his station, tapping away at his computer. His face was tight with concentration. Once we're in, we pull everything we can. We'll need to move fast. Clint's pulse quickened as he absorbed the weight of the situation. 15 minutes. If they succeeded, they would finally have the smoking gun, the evidence that would irrevocably connect the conspiracy to those at the very top of the political food chain. If they failed, they were dead. No one could survive going against this level of power without consequences. We need to be ready to go the second we have the files, Clint said, pacing the room. Once we're in, they'll know. They'll do everything to cover it up. We can't afford to wait around. We leak it immediately. No second guessing. The team nodded in agreement, but Clint could see the fear in their eyes. They were scared, and rightfully so. This wasn't just a digital fight anymore, it was a war. Every move they made from here on out had the potential to make them targets of the most powerful people in the world. Clint, Emily said softly, this is the point of no return. Once we release those files, it's out of our hands. They'll come after us. They'll come after everyone we care about. Clint paused, meeting her eyes. He had never been one to shy away from danger, but this was different. The threat wasn't just physical. It was all-encompassing. If they were going to survive, they needed to be united, each of them trusting that the others had their back. "We can't back down now," Clint said, his voice low but firm. "We started this, and we're going to finish it. We've come too far to stop." The next few minutes were a blur. Sam's fingers flew across the keyboard, breaking down the walls of the encrypted system. Emily was on the phone with their sources, ensuring the media was prepared for the firestorm that was about to be unleashed. Calloway was monitoring the exits, making sure they had a clear route to safety if things went south. Then, the moment arrived. Sam's eyes lit up with a combination of triumph and dread. "We're in." Clint's heart skipped a beat. "Download the files. Now." Emily immediately set up the upload to their secure server. The files were massive, thousands of pages of government documents, emails, contracts, and testimonies. It was everything: the names, the deals, the bribes. The conspiracy's entire web of influence, laid bare for the world to see. It was the kind of information that could topple governments and ruin careers. But there was one catch. They only had limited time before the system's security detected the breach and locked everything down. Sam's face was etched with tension as he monitored the download. "It's taking too long. The encryption is stronger than we thought. We've only got 10 minutes before they notice us," Sam warned, sweat beading on his forehead. Clint glanced at the clock. It was now or never. If they didn't pull this off, they were finished. "Keep going, Sam. We don't have a choice. We'll deal with the fallout after," Clint said, his jaw clenched. "Once you've got it, we release it. Don't wait." The room fell silent as everyone held their breath, waiting. Clint's mind raced as he thought about the consequences of this move. They had been up against the clock for days, and now it felt as though they were in the eye of the storm. One wrong move, and it could all come crashing down. Finally, Sam's voice broke the silence. "We've got it. It's all here. The full set of files." Clint gave a sharp nod. "Release it. All of it." Emily immediately executed the command, sending the files out into the world. Clint watched as the upload bar filled, his hands clenched into fists. This was it. The truth was now in the hands of the public. There was no stopping it. No going back. But as the files began to hit news outlets, Clint noticed something strange. There was a pattern in the reactions, a shift in the way the media was presenting the information. At first, it seemed like the conspiracy was unraveling before their eyes, but then something changed. Journalists who had once supported their cause were now questioning the authenticity of the files. Skepticism spread like wildfire, and a few well-known political figures began to dismiss the revelations as a targeted attack. "They're trying to control the narrative again," Clint muttered, frustration mounting in his chest. Emily's voice was tight with concern. "They're turning the public against us. They're painting us as enemies of the state." Clint slammed his fist on the table. "We can't let them do this. We need to fight back. We can't just release the files and hope they'll believe it. We need more." Just then, Sam's screen lit up with new notifications. It was a message from an anonymous source. Clint's heart skipped a beat as he read the words. "They know. They're coming for you. You've made a mistake. Leave now." Before Clint could react, the sound of a loud bang echoed through the room, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps rushing down the hallway. "They're here," Calloway said, his voice strained. "We have to move. Now." Clint's mind was racing. They had one last chance to escape. One last shot before the storm consumed them all. "Get to the car," Clint ordered. "We don't have much time. Let's go." As the team scrambled to gather their things, Clint felt a cold rush of fear. The conspiracy was no longer something he was fighting to expose. It was now a war for survival. And Clint would do whatever it took to win. The sound of boots pounding on the floor echoed down the hallway. Clint's heart raced as he grabbed his bag, signaling to his team to move quickly. The weight of the encrypted files in his hands felt like a ticking bomb. Every second counted. They had to make it to the car, and fast. "Sam, you're with me," Clint barked. "Calloway, Emily, take the back exit. Don't stop until you're out of sight." The team nodded, but the fear was evident in their eyes. They knew what was coming. The moment they stepped out of the safe house, there would be no more hiding. The conspiracy's people were on their tail, and there was nowhere they could run where they wouldn't be found. They rushed down the narrow hallway, Clint's mind working furiously. Where could they go? They needed to get to a secondary safe house, but it was too risky to trust anyone. The walls were closing in on them. As they reached the door, Clint felt a sharp pang of dread. He could hear the sounds of approaching vehicles outside. They weren't just after him anymore. They were after all of them. "Go, go, go!" Clint shouted, and the team scrambled into the alleyway. The narrow street was eerily quiet, but Clint could see the silhouette of black SUVs parked at the far end. He cursed under his breath. They had anticipated their escape route. "Sam, where's the damn car?" Clint demanded, his voice tight with urgency. 10 seconds, Sam replied, his fingers moving quickly on his phone. Clint didn't wait to hear the rest. He sprinted toward the street, his eyes scanning for any sign of the enemy. They needed the car, and they needed it now. The roar of an engine sounded from behind them, growing louder. Clint's pulse spiked. The SUVs were moving, cutting off their escape. He could feel the pressure building, the sense of inevitability creeping in. "Move faster!" Clint shouted to the team. They turned the corner just as the first SUV screeched to a halt in front of them. Clint's stomach dropped as men in black tactical gear jumped out, weapons drawn. He had seen this scenario play out in his mind, but nothing could prepare him for the brutal reality of it. Emily and Calloway were still behind, but they had no choice. They were cornered. Clint's hand shot to his waistband, where his gun sat in its holster. His breath was coming in quick bursts, but he didn't hesitate. They had trained for this, but the truth was, they weren't prepared for what was about to unfold. One of the men in the SUV barked an order, and suddenly, Clint felt a sharp pain in his side. He looked down to see blood staining his shirt. A shot had grazed him. His instincts kicked in. He pulled his gun and returned fire, forcing the attackers to duck for cover. "We need to get to the car," Clint yelled, his voice strained. "Clint, we're pinned down," Sam shouted back. The situation was rapidly deteriorating. Clint's mind raced. The car was supposed to be their ticket to freedom, but now it seemed like the enemy had anticipated every move. They were surrounded. "Calloway, you take the left flank," Clint shouted. "Emily, get ready to run to the car. I'll cover you." Before Emily could respond, a sharp crack split the air. Clint barely had time to react as one of the men fired at him again, the bullet grazing his shoulder this time. He hissed in pain but refused to go down. This was it. There would be no retreat. "Get to the car, now," Clint shouted again. Emily didn't hesitate. She broke into a sprint, her legs pumping with every ounce of energy she had. Clint watched as she made it to the car, her face set with determination. "Sam, cover her," Clint ordered. Sam hesitated for only a second before nodding and sprinting alongside Emily. Clint stood his ground, his gun raised. He had to buy them time. He knew that once they got to the car, they would have a chance to escape. But that didn't mean they were safe yet. The conspiracy had eyes everywhere. A few more shots rang out, and Clint barely managed to dodge the incoming fire. His chest tightened. There was no way out without a fight. The sound of a car engine roaring to life echoed through the alley. Clint turned just in time to see Emily and Sam jump into the vehicle. The tires screeched as the car tore out of the alley, but Clint was still pinned down, and he was sure the attackers would follow them in minutes. But then something unexpected happened. The sound of another car engine rumbled in the distance. This wasn't an ordinary vehicle. It was fast. Too fast. Clint's heart skipped a beat as a sleek, black car appeared, barreling down the street at breakneck speed. For a brief moment, Clint thought it was an enemy vehicle, but then he saw the insignia. The unmistakable seal of the United States Secret Service. "Move!" Clint yelled, and in the next second, the black car screeched to a halt beside him. The door flew open, and Clint didn't hesitate. He dove inside just as gunfire erupted from the enemy SUV. The door slammed shut, and the car shot forward, weaving through traffic with expert precision. Clint caught his breath, looking at the driver. It was a familiar face. One he had not expected to see again. "Agent Thomas," Clint said, his voice a mix of disbelief and relief. "What the hell are you doing here?" Agent Thomas, a stoic and no-nonsense man in his mid-40s, didn't answer immediately. He kept his eyes on the road, his face grim. "We were monitoring the situation." "You're not the only ones who've been keeping an eye on things, Clint." Clint's mind raced. The Secret Service? Were they working with the conspiracy, or were they trying to help? "Are you with us or against us?" Clint asked, his voice hard. "Let's just say," Agent Thomas replied, "we're on the same side for now. But that's subject to change." Clint didn't know whether to trust him, but for the moment, he had no choice. They had no safe place left. They were in it deep now, and the only way out was through the chaos. The black SUV was still chasing them, but Agent Thomas was an expert driver. The car swerved through intersections, narrowly avoiding a collision as it tore down the streets at high speed. Clint could hear the engine of the SUV in the distance, but it was losing ground. For now, they had a brief respite, but Clint knew it was temporary. The clock was ticking, and the forces against them were closing in fast. There would be no more hiding, no more waiting. The final confrontation was coming. The screech of tires and the distant sounds of sirens echoed behind Clint as the black car sped through the streets. His breath was ragged, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. It was a momentary relief to be out of immediate danger, but Clint knew it wouldn't last. The enemy wasn't just chasing them, they were hunting them, and sooner or later, they'd have to confront the ugly truth: their every move was being watched. Clint glanced over at Agent Thomas, who was focused on the road ahead, his eyes scanning for any potential threats. The man's face was unreadable, the lines of age and experience etched deep into his features. For all the years Clint had known him, he could never figure out where his loyalties truly lay. "Where are we going?" Clint asked, his voice sharp with the frustration building inside him. "And what the hell is going on? I thought you were supposed to be out of this." Agent Thomas kept his eyes on the road, but Clint could see his jaw tighten. "I was," he said, his tone colder than Clint expected. "But things change. You were right about everything, the conspiracy, the cover-up, the power plays. And now, they're after you and anyone who gets in their way." Clint narrowed his eyes. "So you're telling me you just happened to be monitoring the situation?" Thomas gave him a hard glance. "I didn't just happen to be monitoring. I've been tracking this for years. You're not the only one who has a vested interest in bringing this to light." Clint wanted to press further, but before he could ask more questions, the sound of a voice crackled through the car's radio, interrupting the moment. "This is Agent Foster," the voice said, a crackling buzz in the background. "We've been compromised. We need to move to the secondary extraction point, ASAP. The plan has changed." Clint's stomach sank. What do you mean, compromised? Who's been compromised? He turned toward Thomas, eyes wide with alarm. Agent Thomas's face didn't change, but his lips tightened. He hit the button on the dashboard to respond. I'm aware. Hold your position. I'm en route. Clint's mind was racing. Who the hell are we meeting now? He demanded. What's going on? Before Thomas could answer, the car abruptly swerved to the right, veering off the main road and into a narrow alley. The sharp turn threw Clint against his seatbelt. His head slammed into the side of the car with a painful thud. Thomas! Clint snapped, rubbing his neck, trying to shake off the dizziness. What the hell's going on? The car came to a screeching halt, and Thomas turned to face Clint, his face unusually grim. We've been played, Clint. This wasn't just about exposing the truth. The whole thing was a setup from the start. Clint froze. What are you talking about? His mind couldn't process the words fast enough. You think this was all coincidence? Thomas asked, his voice low. The files you stole? The people in the SUVs? The ones chasing you? They're not just political players or government agents, they're all part of the same network. Clint's pulse spiked as he tried to make sense of the revelation. You're saying we've been working with the enemy all this time? Thomas nodded slowly. It's worse than that. We've been feeding them information. The whole time. Clint felt the blood drain from his face. No, that can't be right. It's the truth, Thomas continued. You've been working with people who want the same thing, justice, exposure, and to take down the corrupt elites. But the problem is, not everyone in that fight is who they seem to be. Clint's breath was shallow as he processed the words. So, who's the mole? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Who's been using us all along? Thomas hesitated, his eyes darting around as if trying to gauge whether Clint would react. Finally, he said, it's Foster. She's been feeding them intel from the inside. Clint's head spun. Foster had been with them since the beginning. She had always been the level-headed one, the one who kept everyone grounded. To hear that she was the one responsible for all of this, the one who had been betraying them, felt like a gut punch. Where is she now? Clint demanded, his voice hard. She's the one coordinating the extraction, Thomas replied, his voice tinged with regret. I thought I could trust her, but it's clear now that I've been blind. She's one of them. Clint slammed his fist against the dashboard in frustration. Damn it. I knew something didn't add up. He ran a hand through his hair. We've been played right from the start. Thomas didn't speak, but his gaze remained locked on Clint. The weight of the betrayal hung heavily in the car, pressing down on both of them. Clint felt a wave of anger building inside him. The stakes had always been high, but this was worse than he could have ever imagined. The engine hummed quietly, and Clint's mind began to race with 1,000 different thoughts. There was no way they could trust Foster now, not after everything she had done. The game had changed. They weren't just up against corrupt politicians or corporate elites anymore. They were fighting against the very people they had thought were on their side. We need to confront her, Clint said, his voice steel. Thomas hesitated. I wouldn't recommend it. If she's already gone this far, she won't hesitate to do whatever it takes to cover her tracks. She'll have her people waiting for us. We can't let her get away with this, Clint replied, his jaw clenched. She's taken everything we've worked for. We're going to take her down before she takes us down. The car shifted into gear, and the tires spun as Thomas pushed the accelerator to the floor. Clint braced himself as the car sped toward their next rendezvous. They were driving right into the heart of enemy territory. The city streets blurred by as Agent Thomas navigated the car with precision. Clint's mind churned with thoughts of betrayal, of Foster's treachery. He had trusted her. She had been with them since the beginning, a constant presence in their fight for justice. Now, to think that she was the one feeding information to the enemy felt like a slap in the face. The car's tires screeched as they turned into a secluded parking garage. The concrete pillars cast long shadows in the dim light, making the whole place feel like a tomb. Clint's pulse quickened as he glanced around, feeling the weight of the silence press in on him. There was no turning back now. They were walking into the lion's den, and they had no idea what lay in wait. "Stay sharp," Clint muttered, his voice low. "We don't know how many people she's got on the inside." Thomas nodded but didn't respond. He parked the car in a far corner of the garage, far enough from any potential ambush, but close enough to make a quick exit if things went south. Clint's heart pounded in his chest as he opened the door and stepped into the shadows. The faint hum of fluorescent lights above seemed to mock him, as if reminding him of the dangerous game they were playing. He adjusted his grip on his gun and motioned for Thomas to follow. The sound of their footsteps echoed ominously, and Clint couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "We're almost there," Thomas said in a whisper, his eyes scanning the area. "Foster's team should be waiting for us by the stairwell." We approach cautiously. No sudden moves. Clint nodded, his mind racing with the implications of what they were about to do. He had to confront Foster. He had to get answers. But a part of him, the part that had always believed in their cause, in the truth, was angry. Angry that someone they had trusted was responsible for the pain they were all going through. As they reached the stairwell, Clint motioned for Thomas to stop. He paused, listening. The air was still, but something felt off. A faint sound of movement came from above, but it was too soft to make out. Clint's instincts flared. "Get down," he hissed. They ducked behind a concrete pillar, their backs pressed to the cold surface. Clint's heart raced, every muscle tense. Then, through the small crack in the wall, he saw them, Foster and two armed men, standing in the middle of the stairwell, as if waiting for them. Clint's grip tightened around his weapon. "They knew we were coming," Thomas muttered, his face hardening. "This is a setup." "Not a setup," Clint replied, his voice dripping with disdain. "This is the final act of betrayal." He motioned to Thomas to stay back and took a deep breath. This wasn't just about the mission anymore. It was personal. Clint had to stop her, had to end this before anyone else got hurt. He stepped out from the shadows, his gun raised, ready for whatever came next. "Foster." Clint's voice echoed through the empty garage. "I know what you've been doing. I know you've been feeding them information." She froze, a brief flicker of surprise crossing her face before it was replaced by cold indifference. "Clint, always the hero," Foster said with a mocking smile, her hand resting casually on the gun at her hip. "Did you really think you could win this fight?" Clint's blood boiled at her words. "You're the one who's been playing both sides, aren't you? You've been feeding them our every move." Foster stepped forward, unfazed. "You think I'm the only one who knows what's going on? You've been operating on the wrong side of this fight all along. There's more at play here than you understand. More than just the corrupt politicians and the crooked businessmen. The real power is hidden in plain sight, Clint. And you've been too blind to see it." Clint's grip tightened on his gun, but he kept his voice steady. "That's a load of crap, and you know it. You've sold us out. You've sold your soul to the highest bidder." Foster's smile never wavered. "Don't be naive. I'm not the only one. You've been running around like a pawn, thinking you're going to change the world. But in the end, all you've done is expose yourself. Expose your weakness." The two men with her took a step forward, their weapons trained on Clint and Thomas. Clint's mind raced as he tried to process her words. He had always known there was more to this conspiracy, more than just the people they had been fighting. But now, Foster was telling him that they were all part of something much bigger, something more dangerous. "This doesn't have to end in violence," Clint," Foster continued, her voice softening slightly. "You're smart. You could join us. We could make this all go away. You'll be rewarded. You've already done the hard part." Clint's eyes burned with fury. "Join you? After everything you've done? No chance." He raised his gun, aiming it directly at Foster, his finger trembling on the trigger. For a moment, time seemed to stretch out in front of him. The air was thick with tension, the sound of his heartbeat pounding in his ears. "Clint, don't," Thomas said, his voice tense. "We don't have to kill her. We just need the information." But it was too late. Foster's smile faltered, and she gave a sharp signal to her men. They raised their weapons, and Clint knew that if he didn't act now, they would all be dead. In a split second, Clint pulled the trigger, but before the bullet could leave the chamber, the sharp sound of gunfire rang out. The men with Foster dropped to the ground, lifeless. Clint's heart lurched in his chest. Foster's eyes widened, and she spun around, only to see Agent Thomas standing behind her, his gun smoking in the air. Clint blinked, shock and confusion flooding his mind. "Thomas, what the hell?" Agent Thomas stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "I told you, Clint. I'm not with you, and I'm not with her. I'm with whoever holds the power." Foster's face twisted in shock and rage as she backed away. You double-crossed me." Thomas shrugged, his eyes cold. "You were never part of the plan, Foster. You were just a pawn too." Clint's mind spun, struggling to make sense of the betrayal. Agent Thomas, the one person he had trusted, was just as bad as Foster. "We're not done yet," Clint growled, his eyes locked on Thomas. "This is far from over." Clint's heart was still pounding in his chest, his hands shaking as he stood there, staring at Agent Thomas. The smoke from the gun hung in the air, a grim reminder of what had just transpired. His mind was reeling, processing the weight of the betrayal. Thomas, the man he had trusted for so long, was the one who had orchestrated this entire mess. It felt like the ground had been pulled out from under him, leaving him in freefall. Foster was still reeling from the gunshot, her eyes darting between Clint and Thomas, her mouth working as though she were trying to find the right words. But it was clear that nothing she said could undo the mess she'd made. You really think you can walk away from this?" Foster finally spat, her voice shaking with rage. "You'll regret this, Thomas. You'll both regret it." Clint didn't respond, keeping his focus on Thomas, whose expression was cold, calculating. There was no remorse in his eyes, no sign of hesitation. Clint had always believed Thomas was a man of principle, someone who played the game by his own rules, but now, it was obvious that Thomas had no rules at all. "You're not the only one who's been betrayed, Clint," Thomas said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Foster's betrayal was just a small piece of the puzzle. You think you're the only one trying to take down the system? You've been naive if you believed you could actually make a difference." Clint's blood boiled. "You're one of them, aren't you? All this time, you've been using me, using us, to further your own agenda." Thomas didn't flinch. He didn't even look surprised. Instead, he took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "It's not about me, Clint. It's about power. It's always been about power. The people you're fighting aren't the real enemy. The enemy is the system itself. And I've been working to tear it down from the inside." Clint's fists clenched, his anger boiling over. "By betraying your friends? By selling us out to the highest bidder? That's how you plan to fix the system?" Thomas's lips curled into a faint smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "The system is broken, Clint. And the only way to fix it is by making the tough calls. You wouldn't understand." Clint wanted to argue, wanted to scream, but he knew there was no reasoning with Thomas now. The man had crossed a line, and there was no going back. Foster, still on the floor, growled and pushed herself up. "I'm not done yet, she sneered. You're both dead men walking. But before Clint could respond, the ground suddenly trembled beneath their feet. A deafening roar echoed from above, followed by the sound of doors crashing open. A group of armed men stormed into the parking garage, their boots echoing in the vast concrete space. Clint's eyes widened as he recognized the insignia on their uniforms. They were from the same network Foster and Thomas had been working with. A fresh wave of realization hit him. This wasn't just a betrayal by Thomas. It was an entire operation, one that had been set into motion long before they ever knew it. Clint's heart sank. We need to move. Now. Thomas looked at him, unblinking. I'm not going anywhere. This is where it ends, Clint. You've been a distraction from the real plan. The men surrounded them, weapons drawn. Clint and Thomas both stood at the ready, each of them understanding the gravity of the moment. This was a trap, there was no way out without a fight. The stakes had never been higher. But before the enemy could advance, Clint pulled a flashbang from his belt and tossed it into the air, the loud bang echoing throughout the garage. The lights flickered, blinding them for a brief moment, and Clint used the confusion to his advantage. He grabbed Thomas by the arm and threw him toward a nearby exit, but the chaos that followed was overwhelming. Move! Clint shouted to Thomas, his voice sharp with urgency. But as they ran, Clint could feel the weight of the betrayal still weighing on him. He couldn't let this go, not yet. As they burst through the back door and into the alley, Clint heard the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps behind them, growing louder by the second. They were being hunted. No matter how fast they ran, the enemy was always one step behind. Thomas, surprisingly agile for his age, pulled ahead, his face grim. We can't outrun them, he said, glancing over his shoulder. We don't need to outrun them, Clint replied through gritted teeth. We just need to survive long enough to hit back. They rounded a corner, heading toward a backstreet, but it was clear they wouldn't be able to keep this up for long. The enemy was closing in fast, and Clint's thoughts raced. He needed a way out, a plan. They reached a dead end, a narrow alley with no exit, no way to go except back the way they came. Clint felt his chest tighten. This was it. They had nowhere else to run. Thomas turned to face him, his voice low. This is the end, Clint. You knew it was coming. Clint's eyes darted around, scanning for any way to escape. That's when he saw it, a ladder leading to a fire escape. Without thinking, he sprinted toward it, Thomas following close behind. You can't outrun this, Clint. Thomas shouted, his voice laced with warning. It's over. But Clint didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Not now. Not after everything they had fought for. He reached the ladder and started to climb, his hands gripping the cold metal as he pulled himself higher. Behind him, Thomas cursed and followed suit, though his movements were slower, more deliberate. They reached the top and pulled themselves onto the rooftop. Below them, the sounds of shouting filled the air as their pursuers reached the alley. Clint and Thomas were cornered, no more options. But as Clint glanced around the rooftop, his mind went into overdrive. There had to be a way out. Then, in the distance, Clint saw it, a helicopter, hovering just above the city. A lifeline. Clint grabbed Thomas by the arm and dragged him toward the edge of the building. We've got one shot at this, Clint said, his voice gruff. Either we take that helicopter, or we don't make it out alive. As they sprinted toward the edge, the enemy's gunfire rang out, narrowly missing them. Clint's heart pounded in his chest as he focused on the helicopter, knowing that this would be their final chance. Ready? Clint shouted, adrenaline surging. Ready, Thomas grunted, his face hard. They leaped. Clint's body hurt as he propelled himself off the rooftop, the wind whipping through his hair. His muscles screamed in protest, but he didn't care. In that split second, his focus was on only one thing, the helicopter. It hovered just above the street, its blades roaring as it maintained a steady position. It was their only way out, and failure was not an option. The distance between the rooftop and the hovering chopper seemed impossibly long. His heart hammered in his chest as he calculated their descent. The ground below was a blur of concrete, glass, and chaos. The sounds of gunfire and shouts filled the air. Behind them, their enemies were closing in, scrambling to intercept them before they could escape. Clint's fingers stretched for the edge of the helicopter's landing skid. He knew if he missed, they would fall, and there would be no second chance. The distance was closing fast, and as his hand reached out, the cold steel of the chopper's frame made contact. With all his strength, Clint gripped it, pulling himself upward just as a bullet whizzed by his head. Thomas was right behind him, his hand barely missing the skid as he fought to catch up. Clint's heart skipped a beat. There was no way they could afford to lose the momentum now. But with one final surge of energy, Thomas reached the helicopter, and together, they hoisted themselves onto the landing gear. The helicopter pilot, a stern-faced man with dark sunglasses, glanced back at them as they struggled to find their footing on the skids. "You two are lucky," he said, his voice thick with a southern drawl. "This thing doesn't usually stop for stragglers." Clint didn't have time to respond. Instead, he pointed up. "Get us out of here. Now." The pilot gave a quick nod and spun the helicopter's throttle, the engines roaring louder as they gained altitude. Clint and Thomas clung to the skids, their eyes scanning the city below them. The rooftops, the alleyways, they had made it out, but they weren't safe yet. "How long do we have before they regroup?" Thomas asked, his voice strained with effort as he fought to stay steady on the unstable skids. "Not long," Clint replied, his eyes locked on the horizon. "We're sitting ducks up here. As soon as they regroup, they'll be tracking us. We need to get to a safe house, fast." But as they climbed higher, Clint saw something that made his blood run cold. Down below, another helicopter, a much larger one, was rising into the sky, its silhouette cutting through the thick fog of the city below. It was armed, and it was fast. He could feel it in his gut. They were not just being hunted. They were being trapped. "Looks like we've got company," Clint muttered, his hand instinctively reaching for the weapon at his side. "Hold tight," the pilot called out, his grip tightening on the controls. The helicopter banked sharply to the left, veering away from the oncoming threat, but Clint could already see the black helicopter closing in on them. "We can't outrun them," Thomas said, his voice taut with fear. "We don't need to outrun them. We need to outsmart them," Clint replied, his mind already spinning. "Hold on to something." As the black helicopter got closer, Clint's thoughts raced. He had to think fast. He glanced at the skyline, searching for something, anything, that could give them an edge. Then, his eyes landed on the perfect opportunity. "Pilot!" Clint shouted over the roar of the engines. "Take us to that building, about 2 clicks west. We'll need to hover close to the roof." The pilot glanced at him, his eyes narrowing. "You're asking for trouble. They'll have the high ground." "I don't care," Clint growled. "Just do it." Without hesitation, the pilot adjusted the chopper's course. As they veered toward the building, Clint felt a surge of adrenaline. This was a gamble, but it was their only chance. He turned to Thomas. "You ready?" "Doesn't matter," Thomas replied, gritting his teeth. "We're all in now." The helicopter descended rapidly, closing in on the rooftop as the black helicopter continued to follow. Clint's mind raced as he scanned the rooftop below. He could see it now, a small ledge near the side of the building, perfect for creating an escape route. The helicopter's blades howled in protest as they hovered just inches above the building's edge. Clint grabbed Thomas's arm. "On my mark, we jump." Thomas didn't respond, but Clint could see the tension in his body. The enemy helicopter was now just seconds behind them. Time was running out. Now! Clint shouted. Without thinking, Clint pushed himself off the skid, launching himself toward the building. He felt the wind rushing past him as he fell for what seemed like an eternity. The rooftop was coming up fast, but Clint didn't slow down. He aimed for the ledge, gritted his teeth, and pushed off with every ounce of strength left in him. He landed hard, rolling to absorb the impact. His knees buckled, but he managed to stay on his feet. Glancing back, Clint saw Thomas landing just behind him, his body tumbling as he struggled to stay upright. They both scrambled to their feet and ran toward the edge of the building, looking for cover. Behind them, the black helicopter hovered above, its weapons trained on their position. Clint knew it was only a matter of seconds before the enemy opened fire. "Move!" Clint shouted. They darted toward the far side of the rooftop, taking shelter behind a large air conditioning unit. The chopper above them circled, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "This is it," Thomas said, his voice filled with dread. "We're cornered." "No," Clint replied, his voice low but steady. "We're not cornered yet. We still have options." Suddenly, the sound of gunfire shattered the air. The chopper fired a warning shot that exploded just inches from their cover. Clint's heart skipped a beat. He pulled out his weapon, crouching lower behind the unit. "On my signal," Clint said, his eyes scanning the sky for the next move. "We'll make our move." But before he could give the signal, the chopper made a sharp dive toward them. Clint's blood ran cold. They were out of time. Clint's breath came in sharp, panicked bursts as the black helicopter dove toward the rooftop. The whirring of its blades grew louder, the thunderous sound reverberating through the city streets below. They were running out of time, there was no more room for mistakes. The odds were stacked against them, and the end of their escape was drawing closer by the second. Behind their cover, Clint's heart raced. His mind, though, was clear, he had to think fast. His body was already reacting to the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He looked at Thomas, who was crouching beside him, eyes wide with fear but also determination. "We need to take them down now, or this ends for us," Clint muttered. Thomas didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. They had done all they could, and now they had to face the inevitable. The black helicopter hovered just above them, its weapons aiming down, seeking the perfect shot. Clint's eyes flicked back to the building's edge, there had to be a way out, something they hadn't thought of yet. "Clint!" Thomas hissed, urgently pointing. "The power lines. If we can get to them, we might be able to disrupt their targeting system." Clint's eyes followed Thomas's finger and his heart skipped a beat. Above, a series of thick power lines ran along the rooftops, dangerously close to where the chopper was hovering. He didn't hesitate. They had no other choice. "Get ready," Clint whispered. He nodded to Thomas, and in that split second, they both moved in unison, running toward the edge of the building. They had to be quick, one wrong move, and they were done. The chopper fired another burst of gunfire, the rounds cracking the concrete around them. Clint kept moving, ignoring the barrage of bullets that skimmed the edge of his clothing. His mind was focused solely on the power lines ahead. They reached the edge. Clint took a deep breath, calculating the risk. The helicopter was descending closer, its shadow looming over them, and there was only one shot left to take. "Now!" Clint shouted. With every ounce of strength, they sprinted toward the power lines. Clint grabbed the nearest one, wrapping his arm around it as he swung his body onto it. The wire trembled under his weight, and for a second, he feared it would snap under the tension. But it held firm. He shot a quick glance back. Thomas had followed suit, grabbing the second line with both hands and pulling himself up. He made the jump just as the helicopter's searchlights flickered on, casting a deadly beam over the rooftop. Clint's heart raced as they began climbing the power lines, their bodies tight against the cables. The helicopter made a sharp turn, preparing for another assault, but the proximity to the power lines was their best shot. From his perch, Clint glanced down and saw a potential opening. The helicopter's targeting system was malfunctioning, the signal scrambled by the surge from the power lines. He could see the pilot's confusion through the small glass window. It was now or never. Clint motioned to Thomas, signaling him to get ready. "On 3, he whispered. Thomas nodded, his face tense. 1, 2, 3. Clint shouted, and without warning, both of them let go of the power lines at the same time, free-falling toward the building below. The air rushed past them as they descended, the sound of the helicopter's pursuit growing louder. It was a leap of faith, but it was their only chance. With a hard thud, Clint landed on the next rooftop, his knees buckling from the impact but managing to roll with the fall. Thomas wasn't far behind. The two of them scrambled to their feet, both winded and battered but alive. They didn't have time to celebrate. As they sprinted across the rooftop, Clint turned his head to see the black helicopter angling to make another pass. He cursed under his breath, this wasn't over yet. "Where's the backup?" Thomas shouted, desperation in his voice. "Coming," Clint responded quickly, his eyes scanning the streets below, searching for a way out. Suddenly, through the clouds of smoke and chaos, Clint saw movement on the ground, a convoy of black SUVs screeching around the corner. Reinforcements. They were here. Clint didn't hesitate. He knew that if they could make it to the ground and get to the cars, they had a shot at escaping. "Down the fire escape, now!" Clint shouted, and without waiting for Thomas's response, he darted for the emergency exit door, pulling it open and bolting down the narrow stairwell. The helicopter, desperate to stop them, began firing once again, the bullets tearing into the rooftop above them, but Clint was already on the move. He didn't look back. They had come too far to give up now. Reaching the bottom of the fire escape, Clint and Thomas dashed toward the alley, hearts pounding. The SUVs were parked at the mouth of the alley, and armed men in tactical gear piled out, guns drawn. "Get in," one of the operatives shouted, motioning for them to hurry. Clint grabbed Thomas by the arm, yanking him toward the vehicle. As they jumped inside, the doors slammed shut, and the driver sped off into the night. The helicopter was still above them, chasing relentlessly, but with each twist and turn, they gained distance. Clint slumped back in his seat, his body exhausted, his heart still racing from the close call. "We made it," Thomas said breathlessly, his voice rough from the strain. Clint nodded, his hand gripping the seat tightly as the SUV barreled through the streets. But he knew this wasn't the end. Not yet. The city was still dangerous, and there were too many unanswered questions. The betrayal from Thomas, the twisted game being played, and the people who had been pulling the strings all remained shrouded in mystery. For now, though, Clint allowed himself a moment of relief. They had escaped the immediate threat. They had survived. But as the SUV sped away into the night, Clint knew this was just the beginning of a much larger battle. The fight was far from over. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?